Staff Sergeant Marcus Mark Hoffman shuffled his worn boots across the cobblestone courtyard of Fort Wilhelm, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp German morning air. At 24, he'd already served 6 years in the Prussian infantry, earning respect for his tactical brilliance and natural leadership. His fellow soldiers looked up to him during training exercises, where his quick thinking and military precision made their unit one of the most efficient in the regiment. But respect on the battlefield meant nothing when you crossed Colonel Friedrich Weber. Weber stood 6 feet tall with steel gray eyes that seemed to bore straight through a man's soul. He'd built his reputation on maintaining the old Prussian way: absolute discipline, unwavering honor, and zero tolerance for anything that tarnished the regiment's sterling reputation. To Weber, every soldier was either an asset or a liability, and he'd made it clear which category he believed Hoffman belonged in. The trouble started 3 months ago during off-duty hours. Like most soldiers, Hoffman enjoyed card games with his fellow troops, harmless fun that helped pass the long evenings between training sessions. He was naturally gifted at poker, reading tells and calculating odds with the same tactical mind that made him excel in combat scenarios. His winnings were modest, but consistent. Weber didn't see it that way. "Sergeant Hoffman," Weber's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "Report to my office. Now." Hoffman's stomach tightened. This was the 3rd summons in 2 weeks. He straightened his uniform and followed the colonel into the stark stone building that housed the regimental headquarters. Weber's office smelled of leather and tobacco, with military decorations covering every available wall space. "Sit," Weber commanded, not looking up from the papers on his desk. Hoffman remained standing. "Sir, if this is about last night's card game, it's about your pattern of behavior, Sergeant." Weber finally raised his eyes, and Hoffman felt the familiar chill of the colonel's disapproval. "I've received another complaint. Private Muller claims you somehow knew what cards he was holding." "Sir, that's impossible. I simply played the odds and read his reactions." "Don't insult my intelligence." Weber stood slowly, his chair creaking. "I've been watching you, Hoffman. Your fellow soldiers don't trust you. They whisper about your lucky streaks and mysterious wins. In the Prussian army, trust between brothers in arms is sacred. Without it, you're worthless to me." Hoffman felt heat rising in his cheeks. "Colonel, I've never cheated. My combat record speaks for itself. During the Leipzig exercises, my squad completed our objectives faster than any other unit. I've trained half the new recruits in small unit tactics. My loyalty to Prussia and this regiment is absolute." Weber circled his desk like a predator, stalking prey. "Your tactical skills are adequate, I'll grant you that. But character, Sergeant, character is what separates soldiers from criminals. And your character is deeply flawed." The words hit Hoffman harder than any physical blow. He'd dedicated his life to military service, believing he'd found his calling in the structured world of the army. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved, was being dismissed because of whispered accusations and Weber's rigid prejudices. "Sir, I request the opportunity to clear my name. Let me face my accusers directly." "Denied." Weber returned to his seat, dismissing Hoffman. With a wave, "You're confined to barracks for the next week. Use that time to reflect on what it truly means to be a Prussian soldier. Perhaps you'll discover some semblance of honor before it's too late." As Hoffman walked back across the courtyard, he noticed the sideways glances from other soldiers. Some looked sympathetic, others suspicious. Word of Weber's accusations was already spreading through the ranks like wildfire. His reputation, the one thing he'd valued most, was crumbling before his eyes. That evening, as he sat alone in the empty barracks while his unit enjoyed their usual card game in the mess hall, Hoffman stared out at the German countryside and wondered if Colonel Weber was right. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe he never had. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Weber had plans for him, plans that would ultimately change the course of his entire life and, eventually, reshape American criminal history forever. The week of confinement felt like a month. Hoffman paced the barracks like a caged animal, his mind racing with frustration and growing resentment. Each morning he watched through the windows as his fellow soldiers conducted drills he'd once led. They moved with precision he'd helped teach them, but now he was an outsider looking in. Colonel Weber made sure he felt it. On the third day, Hoffman's close friend Erich Muller, not to be confused with the soldier who'd accused him, managed to slip away from evening duties to visit. "Mark, you need to know what's happening out there," Erich whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Weber's been asking questions about your family background, your life before the army. He's building a case against you." Hoffman's blood ran cold. "What kind of case?" "He's claiming you have a pattern of dishonest behavior stretching back to your civilian days. He's even contacted your former employer in Kassel, that blacksmith you worked for before enlisting. Heinrich praised my work when I left. He said I was the most reliable apprentice he'd ever had." Erich's expression grew darker. "Weber's version is different. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you were let go for stealing tools and materials." The accusation hit Hoffman like a physical blow. Heinrich had been like a father to him, the man who'd encouraged him to join the military in the first place. The idea that Weber would twist that relationship into something corrupt made his stomach turn. "That's a complete lie, Erich. Heinrich gave me his blessing when I enlisted. He even gifted me his best hammer as a farewell present." "I know, Mark, but Weber's convincing. He has this way of making his version sound more credible than the truth." But over the following days, the isolation grew worse. Soldiers who'd once sought his advice now avoided eye contact. During meal times, the only period he was allowed outside the barracks, conversations would stop when he approached. Whispers followed him everywhere. Weber's campaign was working perfectly. On the sixth day, Hoffman was summoned to the colonel's office again. This time, Weber wasn't alone. Major Klaus Richter, the regiment's second-in-command, sat rigidly in a chair beside Weber's desk. Hoffman had always respected Richter. The man was known for his fairness and integrity. "Sergeant Hoffman," Weber began, his voice carrying a false tone of regret. "Major Richter and I have been reviewing your service record and the recent allegations against you." Richter shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "After careful consideration," Weber continued, "we've concluded that your continued presence in this regiment poses a threat to unit cohesion and morale. The trust necessary for effective military operations has been irreparably damaged." Hoffman felt the room spinning. "Sir, I request a formal hearing. Let me face my accusers properly, with witnesses and evidence." "The decision has been made," Weber cut him off. "You have two choices. Request a transfer to another regiment, where your reputation will inevitably follow you, or accept an honorable discharge and return to civilian life." The trap was complete. Weber had poisoned his reputation so thoroughly that transfer would be meaningless. Every officer in the German army would hear Weber's version of events before Hoffman ever arrived at a new post. Major Richter finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "Mark, perhaps civilian life offers you opportunities the military cannot. You're young, skilled, intelligent. There's no shame in choosing a different path." Hoffman looked into Richter's eyes and saw something that gave him hope. The major didn't believe Weber's lies. But even Richter's support couldn't overcome the colonel's authority. "I choose discharge, sir," Hoffman said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Weber smiled for the first time in weeks. "Wise decision, Sergeant. Your discharge papers will be ready tomorrow morning. I trust you'll find your way to the train station without difficulty." As Hoffman walked out of Weber's office for the final time, he felt something changing inside him. The rigid moral code that had guided his military service was cracking. If honesty and integrity meant nothing, if men like Weber could destroy careers with lies and manipulation, then maybe the world operated by different rules than he'd been taught. That night, Erich found him packing his meager belongings. "Where will you go?" Erich asked. Hoffman folded his uniform carefully, knowing he'd never wear it again. "America, I think. I hear it's a place where a man can start fresh, where your past doesn't have to define your future." "And then what?" Hoffman paused, looking at the Prussian military insignia he'd once worn with such pride. "Then I suppose I'll find out what kind of man I really am when honor and rules don't matter anymore." Erich gripped his shoulder. "Don't let Weber destroy who you are, Mark. You're better than his lies." But as Hoffman walked toward the train station the next morning, carrying everything he owned in a single bag, He wondered if Eric was right. Maybe Weber had seen something in him that others had missed. Maybe this was who he'd always been, and military discipline had simply kept his true nature in check. America would be the test. In a new country with no reputation to protect and no rules to follow except the ones he chose, Marcus Hoffman would discover exactly what kind of man he could become. Ellis Island's processing halls echoed with dozens of languages, but Marcus, now calling himself Mark Hansen to shed his German identity, heard only suspicion in every English word directed his way. 3 months in America had taught him that his thick accent marked him as the enemy. The Great War had ended, but anti-German sentiment still burned hot in American hearts. His first job lasted 2 weeks. The construction foreman, a red-faced Irishman named O'Brien, had seemed willing to overlook Mark's heritage in exchange for strong hands and a willingness to work dangerous heights. But when tools started disappearing from the worksite, O'Brien's suspicions fell immediately on the German. "I seen you eyeing those hammers, Hansen," O'Brien snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Probably sending the good stuff back to your Kaiser friends, ain't ya?" Mark had learned enough English to defend himself, but his protests only seemed to confirm O'Brien's beliefs. The missing tools turned up the next day in another worker's locker, but by then Mark was already blacklisted from every construction crew in the borough. The pattern repeated itself everywhere he sought work: docks, factories, restaurants. His accent preceded his reputation, and his reputation was written in the headlines of every newspaper. German saboteurs strike again. Hun spies among us. Trust no German face. By winter of 1919, Mark was living in a cramped boarding house in Lower Manhattan, sharing a room with 2 Italian immigrants who spoke no English but still looked at him with suspicion. His savings were nearly gone, and legitimate work seemed impossible to find. That's when he met Vincent "Vinny" Torino. Vinny was everything Mark wasn't: smooth-talking, American-born, and completely without scruples. He ran numbers for a local gambling operation and had watched Mark lose the last of his money in increasingly desperate card games. "You know, German," Vinny said one night as they shared a bottle of bootleg whiskey, "you got skills that are going to waste. I seen you read people at the poker table. You got discipline most of these street thugs ain't never gonna have. Why? You trying so hard to play by rules that don't apply to you?" Mark stared into his glass, thinking of Colonel Weber's words about character and honor. "Because it's who I am." "No, it's who you were," Vinny corrected. "In the old country, with your fancy uniform and your officer friends. But this is America, pal. Land of opportunity. And opportunity don't care where you come from, it only cares what you're willing to do to grab it." The conversation haunted Mark for days. He walked the streets of New York, watching legitimate citizens go about their business while he remained. An outsider, forever marked by his accent and heritage, the American dream felt like a cruel joke played on men like him. The breaking point came on a bitter February morning when Mark applied for a job at Brennan's hardware store. The owner, Michael Brennan, was a first-generation Irish immigrant who'd built a modest but successful business. Mark hoped that one immigrant might understand another's struggle. Brennan looked up from his ledger when Mark entered, taking in his worn clothes and hearing his accent in the simple greeting. "We ain't hiring," Brennan said immediately. "Please, sir, I have experience with tools, with metalwork. I was a blacksmith's apprentice before. I said we ain't hiring, especially not your kind." Mark felt the familiar frustration building, but he pressed on. "Mr. Brennan, I understand your concerns, but I'm a hard worker. I can provide references." "References from who? Other Huns?" Brennan stood up, his face reddening. "My son Patrick died at Belleau Wood fighting your people. You think I'm going to put food on your table after what you did to my boy?" The words hit Mark like physical blows. "Sir, I never fought against America. I was discharged before the war even began." "Get out!" Brennan's voice was deadly quiet. "Get out before I call the police and tell them there's a German asking suspicious questions about my business." Mark walked out into the cold Manhattan streets, something fundamental breaking inside him. He'd tried to play by their rules, tried to earn an honest living, tried to be the man his military training had shaped him to be. But America had made it clear, Men like him weren't welcome in their legitimate world. That night, he found Vinny at their usual speakeasy. "You look different, German," Vinny observed. "Like you finally figured something out." Mark ordered whiskey. Real whiskey, not the watered-down stuff he'd been forcing himself to drink to save money. "I need work, Vinny. Real work. The kind that pays enough to live on?" Vinny grinned. "Now you're talking sense. What kind of skills you got besides reading poker tells?" Mark thought about his military training. Small unit tactics, planning, reconnaissance, leadership under pressure. "I know how to organize men for difficult operations. I understand timing, coordination, intelligence gathering." "Intelligence gathering?" Vinny's eyes lit up. "Like figuring out what people don't want you to know?" "Exactly. And you can keep men focused under pressure? Keep them from panicking when things go wrong?" Mark nodded. "It's what I was trained for." Vinny leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I got some friends who could use a man like you. Smart guy who thinks before he acts. The kind of jobs they do, they need planning, discipline, teamwork, military stuff." "What kind of jobs?" Vinny smiled, but there was something cold in his expression. "The kind that don't care where you come from, only whether you can get them done. The kind that pay real money to men who ain't afraid to take real risks." Mark stared at his reflection in the amber whiskey, seeing a stranger's face looking back. The idealistic young soldier who'd once believed in honor and duty was gone, destroyed by men like Weber who wore righteousness like a badge while practicing cruelty as an art. "When do we start?" he asked. Vinny raised his glass in a toast. "Welcome to America, partner. The real America." As Mark drank, he felt the last of Marcus Hoffman die. In his place sat a man who understood that survival required adaptation, that success demanded abandoning the moral luxuries he could no longer afford. America had taught him its most important lesson. In a world that operated by might and manipulation, only fools clung to principles that guaranteed their destruction. 3 months into his new career, Mark Hansen discovered he had a talent for crime that matched his former military aptitude. Working with Vinny's crew, small-time thieves and con artists who specialized in targeting wealthy immigrants, he found himself naturally gravitating toward the role of planner and strategist. His first score was a jewelry store on the Upper East Side. While the other men wanted to smash and grab, Mark spent a week studying the shop, learning the owner's routines, identifying the blind spots in the security arrangements. When they finally struck, it was surgical. In and out, in under 3 minutes, with no violence and no witnesses. "You got a gift, German," said Tommy Kowalski, a Polish-American burglar who'd become Mark's closest associate in the crew. "Most guys, they think crime is about being tough or desperate, but you treat it like it's some kind of science." Mark was counting his share of the take, more money than he'd made in 6 months of legitimate work attempts. "Every problem has a solution if you approach it systematically. Military training taught me that. But success brought attention, and attention brought trouble." Detective Raymond Burke of the NYPD had been tracking their crew for months. Burke was old-school Irish cop, the kind who'd grown up fighting for respect in neighborhoods where your fists mattered more than your badge. He'd served briefly in France during the war and came home with strong opinions about Germans in general. The detective's investigation led him to the boarding house where Mark lived. Burke arrived on a rainy Thursday evening, his badge gleaming under the dim hallway lights. "Marcus Hansen," Burke said, his voice carrying the authority of the law. "Though I'm guessing that ain't your real name, is it, Fritz?" Mark kept his expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean, detective." "Sure you don't." Burke pushed past him into the cramped room. "Nice little setup you got here. Amazing how well a man can live when he don't have to earn his money honest." Burke began searching through Mark's belongings, the few clothes, the military manual he'd kept hidden, the small notebook where he sketched ideas for future jobs. "Interesting reading material," Burke commented, flipping through the tactical manual. "Most Americans, they don't study German military strategy for fun, unless they got other reasons." Mark felt the familiar frustration building. The same helpless anger he'd experienced with Colonel Weber. "Detective, I'm a legal immigrant. I've broken no laws that you can prove." Burke laughed harshly. "Broken no laws? Son, I got witnesses who can place you near 3 different robbery scenes. I got shop owners who remember your accent, your face. Problem is, I can't quite get enough evidence to make charges stick." The detective moved closer, invading Mark's personal space the way Weber used to do. "But here's what I know about you, Hans or Marcus or whatever you're calling yourself today. You think you're smarter than us dumb American cops. You think your German efficiency makes you some kind of criminal mastermind. I think nothing of the sort. No? Then let me educate you about something." Burke grabbed Mark's notebook, tearing out pages of carefully drawn floor plans and timing calculations. "This ain't Prussia, boy. This is America. And in America, we got ways of dealing with foreign troublemakers who think they can outsmart the system." Burke dropped the torn pages on the floor, grinding them under his heel. "Here's how this works. I'm going to be watching you. Every move you make, every person you talk to, every job you even think about pulling. And when you slip up, and you will slip up because your kind always does, I'm going to be right there to put you where you belong." The detective headed toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Hansen? Next time we meet, it won't be for conversation. Next time you'll be in handcuffs wondering how you ever thought you could beat the American system." After Burke left, Mark sat among the scattered pages of his notebook, feeling the walls closing in around him. The detective's threat was real. He'd seen enough corrupt cops in his few months in America to know that Burke could make his life impossible whether he had evidence or not. That night, he met with Vinny at their usual speakeasy to discuss the situation. "Burke's got a reputation," Vinny explained over bootleg gin. "He don't always play by the rules, but he gets results. If he's got his sights on you, you're in real trouble." "So what do I do?" Vinny studied Mark's face carefully. "You got 2 choices. You can go straight, get some legitimate job washing, dishes or sweeping floors, and hope Burke eventually loses interest. Or you can get smart, real smart. Smart enough that cops like Burke can't touch you no matter how hard they try." Mark thought about his conversation with Burke, about the detective's casual assumption that he was just another dumb criminal who'd eventually make a mistake. The patronizing tone, the ethnic slurs, the deliberate destruction of his property. It all reminded him of Weber's systematic campaign to destroy his military career. What would getting smart look like? Vinny leaned forward conspiratorially. "There's bigger opportunities out there, German. Jobs that require real planning, real skill. The kind of operations that make you rich enough to buy protection, smart, enough to stay ahead of guys like Burke." "What kind of operations?" "Banks," Vinny said simply. "The real money's in banks, but banks ain't jewelry stores. They got security, alarms, guards. They need the kind of military thinking you bring to the table." Mark considered the proposition. Bank robbery was a federal crime, far more serious than the petty theft he'd been committing, but it was also the kind of challenge that appealed to his tactical mind. Complex, dangerous, requiring precise coordination and flawless execution. Who else would be involved? "I know guys, good guys, professionals who understand that crime is a business, not a hobby. We do it right, we make enough money to disappear. Maybe head west, start fresh somewhere Burke and his friends can't reach." Mark looked around the dingy speakeasy, filled with men who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control. Immigrants like himself, veterans struggling to find their place in peacetime, workers displaced by a changing economy, all of them looking for a way out of poverty and powerlessness. "How would we start?" Vinny smiled. "First we find the right bank, then we do what you do best, we make a plan." As Mark walked home through the dark streets of Manhattan, he felt himself crossing another line. The petty thievery had been about survival, but this was different. This was about taking control, about refusing to be victims of men like Weber and Burke, who used their authority to crush anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptable humanity. If America wouldn't let him succeed through honest work, then he'd succeed on his own terms. And if Detective Burke wanted to play games, Mark would show him what a real German military education could accomplish when applied to the American criminal justice system. The war between them was just beginning. For 2 weeks, Mark Hansen studied the First National Bank of Brooklyn with the intensity of a general planning an assault. He approached the reconnaissance phase exactly as his Prussian training had taught him. Gather intelligence, identify weaknesses, calculate probabilities, prepare for contingencies. The bank occupied a corner building in a prosperous neighborhood, its marble facade projecting stability and security. Mark visited daily, sometimes as a potential customer asking about loan rates, other times as a businessman inquiring about safe deposit boxes. Each visit revealed new details about the building's layout, the staff's routines, the security measures in place. Detective Burke's investigation had forced Mark to be more careful, but it had also sharpened his skills. Every plan now included multiple escape routes, detailed timing calculations, and contingencies for law enforcement response. Burke's harassment had inadvertently created a more dangerous criminal. Vinny had assembled their crew carefully. Besides themselves, there was Tommy Kowalski for his safe-cracking expertise, Danny Sullivan as their lookout, an Irish kid from the neighborhood who could blend in anywhere, and most importantly, Eddie Torino, Vinny's cousin who'd learned to drive racing cars before the war and could handle any vehicle at any speed. They met in the back room of Torino's garage where Eddie worked as a legitimate mechanic while planning decidedly illegitimate activities. The walls were covered with Mark's hand-drawn maps and floor plans, timing charts, and detailed notes about every aspect of the operation. "Never seen anything like this," Tommy whistled, studying Mark's work. "Most guys, they walk in with guns blazing and hope for the best." "You're treating this like some kind of military operation." "Because that's exactly what it is," Mark replied. "The principles are identical. Identify the objective, neutralize opposition, achieve the goal, withdraw safely. The only difference is we're after money instead of territory." Eddie examined the escape route calculations. "You really think we can hit them and be out of the city in under 20 minutes? If we execute properly, yes, but that requires discipline and precision. No improvisation, no heroics, no deviation from the plan." Danny, who was barely 19 but had already served time for burglary, seemed nervous about the military-style approach. What if something goes wrong? What if the plan breaks down? Mark had been expecting this question. It was the same one nervous soldiers always asked before their first real combat operation. "Plans always encounter problems," he explained. "That's why we prepare for the most likely complications in advance. We know the bank manager's routine, the guard's patrol schedule, the typical police response time for this neighborhood. We've accounted for variables." Vinny nodded approvingly. "See, this is why I wanted the German on this job. Most crews, they plan for success but not for trouble. Mark plans for everything." Over the following days, they rehearsed the operation repeatedly in Eddie's garage. Mark had constructed a mock-up of the bank's interior using chalk lines on the concrete floor, allowing each man to practice his specific role until it became second nature. Tommy would handle the vault while Mark controlled the main floor. Danny would maintain communication with Eddie, who'd keep the escape vehicle running outside. Vinny would manage crowd control and watch for unexpected complications. "Remember," Mark emphasized during their final rehearsal, "we're not thugs robbing a bank. We're professionals executing a carefully planned operation. Violence is a last resort, not a first option. We get in, get the money, get out, clean and efficient." The night before the job, Mark sat alone in his boarding house room, cleaning and checking his pistol, a military-issue Luger he'd acquired through criminal contacts. Tomorrow would determine whether his theories about applying military tactics to criminal enterprises were correct. He thought about Detective Burke, probably at home with his family, confident that he was closing in on the German troublemaker. Burke represented everything Mark had come to despise about American authority: the casual racism, the abuse of power, the assumption that immigrants like him could never be smart enough to challenge the system. Tomorrow would be Mark's answer. To men like Burke and Weber, proof that their underestimation of him had been a fatal mistake. At dawn, Mark received an unexpected visitor. Tommy knocked softly on his door, his face pale with anxiety. "We got a problem, Mark. Danny's been picked up by the cops." Mark's blood ran cold. "When? What for?" "Last night, around midnight. Burke got him on some old warrant, probably trumped-up charges." But that ain't the worst part. What's the worst part? Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. Word is, Burke offered him a deal. Give up information about our crew, especially about you, and they'll let him walk. Mark felt the familiar rage building, the same fury he'd experienced when Weber destroyed his military career through lies and manipulation. But this time, he had the skills and resources to fight back. Has Danny talked? Don't know yet. But Burke's smart. He knows Danny's the weak link, the one most likely to crack under pressure. Mark considered their options. They could abandon the job, scatter, and hope Burke couldn't build a case without Danny's testimony. Or they could proceed as planned, knowing they might be walking into a trap. What do you think we should do? Tommy asked. Mark looked out his window at the bustling streets of New York, filled with people going about their legitimate business, while he remained forever an outsider. He thought about all the doors that had been closed to him, all the opportunities denied because of his accent and heritage. We proceed with the operation, he said finally, but we modify the plan to account for potential police interference. Tommy looked shocked. You want to rob the bank knowing Burke might be waiting for us? Mark smiled grimly. Tommy, I've been fighting men like Burke my entire adult life. They think they hold all the advantages because they wear badges and represent authority, but they've made one crucial mistake. What's that? They've underestimated what a German soldier can accomplish when he stops trying to play by their rules. As Mark began sketching modifications to their escape plan, he felt the final transformation taking place. The honest young man who'd once believed in honor and duty was gone forever. In his place stood someone far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and the skills to make that lack of limitations into a weapon. Detective Burke wanted a war? Mark Hansen was ready to give him one. At exactly 9:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Mark Hansen walked through the bronze doors of First National Bank of Brooklyn, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase. To any observer, he looked like a successful businessman conducting routine financial affairs. Inside the briefcase were detailed floor plans, timing charts, and a loaded Luger pistol. The bank's marble interior buzzed with quiet activity. 3 tellers served customers behind ornate brass cages, while bank manager William Thompson conducted business from his glass-walled office. 2 armed guards flanked the main entrance, their attention focused on the street outside rather than the well-dressed patrons within. Mark had spent weeks learning every detail of this space, but seeing it now through the eyes of a predator rather than a customer gave him a different perspective. The sight lines, the blind spots, the positions that offered tactical advantage. Everything looked exactly as his reconnaissance had indicated. At 9:52, Vinny entered through the side door, nodding to Mark as he approached one of the teller windows. Tommy followed 3 minutes later, his lock-picking tools concealed in the false bottom of his tool bag. Outside, Eddie waited behind the wheel of their stolen Packard, its engine idling quietly. Danny's absence created a complication, but Mark had adjusted their plan accordingly. Instead of having a dedicated lookout, they would rely on Eddie's street-level perspective and their own situational awareness. At precisely 10 a.m., Mark approached the information desk where a young woman sat sorting customer files. "Excuse me, miss," he said politely, his German accent carefully modulated, to sound sophisticated rather than threatening. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson about opening a business account." "Certainly, sir. May I have your name?" "Marcus Weber," Mark replied, choosing the surname of his former colonel with bitter irony. "I represent Weber Import Company." As the secretary went to fetch Thompson, Mark surveyed the bank one final time. Everything was exactly as planned, until he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Detective Burke sat in the customer waiting area, pretending to read a newspaper while maintaining clear sight lines to both entrances. Mark's mind raced through the implications. Burke's presence could mean Danny had talked, or it could be coincidence. The detective conducting his own surveillance. Either way, the operation was now exponentially more dangerous. He caught Vinny's eye and gave a subtle hand signal they'd developed during their military-style training. Vinny acknowledged with a barely perceptible nod, then moved toward Tommy to pass along the warning. "Mr. Weber, The secretary had returned with Thompson, a portly man in his 50s who exuded the confidence of someone who'd never been robbed. "Mr. Thompson will see you now." Mark followed Thompson into his office, hyper-aware of Burke's presence just 20 feet away. Through the glass walls, he could see the detective watching their interaction with obvious interest. "Now then, Mr. Weber," Thompson began, settling behind his desk, "tell me about your import business." Mark launched into a prepared story about shipping textiles from Europe, all while calculating angles and timing. Thompson's office had direct access to the vault area, exactly as Mark's reconnaissance had indicated. The manager's desk drawer was slightly open, revealing what appeared to be a small revolver. "Fascinating business," Thompson was saying. "Europe's recovery from the war has created tremendous opportunities for—" Mark stood abruptly, drawing his Luger in one smooth motion. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to remain calm and do exactly what I tell you." Thompson's eyes went wide, his hand moving instinctively toward the desk drawer. "Don't," Mark said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, but I will if you force me to. Now please remove that revolver from your drawer and place it on the desk." Thompson complied with shaking hands, his face pale with shock. Outside the office, Mark could see Vinny and Tommy moving into position. Vinny approached the teller windows while Tommy headed toward the vault area. Neither seemed to have noticed Burke yet. "Mr. Thompson," Mark continued, "you're going to walk with me to the vault. You're going to open it calmly and professionally. If anyone asks, you're showing me your security procedures as part of our business discussion." "Please," Thompson whispered. "I have a family." "Which is why you're going to cooperate," Mark interrupted. "I'm a professional, Mr. Thompson. Violence is bad for business." They left the office together, Mark's pistol concealed but ready. As they walked toward the vault, he noticed Burke folding his newspaper and standing up. The detective's hand moved toward his jacket, toward his service weapon. Everything was about to go wrong. Mark made a split-second decision based on his military training: when circumstances change, adapt immediately, or face disaster. "Attention, everyone," he called out in a clear, commanding voice. "This is a robbery. If everyone remains calm and follows instructions, no one will be hurt." The bank erupted in controlled chaos. Customers dropped to the floor or pressed against walls. Tellers raised their hands. The two guards spun toward Mark, reaching for their weapons, but Detective Burke was already moving, his service revolver appearing in his hand with practiced speed. "Police!" Burke shouted, his weapon trained on Mark. "Drop your weapon now!" The bank guards hesitated, caught between Burke's authority and Mark's proximity to their manager. In that moment of confusion, Mark's military training took over completely. "Mr. Thompson, stay close to me," Mark commanded, using the bank manager as partial cover while keeping his Luger visible. "Detective Burke, I suggest you consider the safety of these innocent people before you do something rash." Vinny had produced his own pistol and was herding customers away from the line of fire. Tommy, caught near the vault, raised his hands but remained ready to move. "You're surrounded, Hanson," Burke called out, his Irish accent thick with tension. "There's no way out of this. Surrender now, and maybe we can work something out." Mark almost laughed at the detective's transparent lie. Men like Burke didn't make deals with men like him. They made examples. "Detective, you have two choices," Mark replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd once used to command soldiers under fire. "You can start shooting in a crowded bank and risk killing innocent Americans to catch one German immigrant, or you can let us walk out of here and pursue us through proper channels." "You think I'm bluffing?" "I think you're a career cop who knows that dead civilians make for very uncomfortable investigations." The standoff stretched for long seconds. Mark could hear Eddie outside, revving the Packard's engine in preparation for a quick departure. The bank's alarm system began wailing, triggered by one of the tellers. Burke's eyes darted between Mark and the frightened customers. Several women were crying softly, and an elderly man near the entrance looked dangerously pale. "All right, Hanson," Burke said finally. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Mark began backing toward the vault area, keeping Thompson close. "Vinny, Tommy, we're leaving, now!" Tommy grabbed several bags of cash from the open teller drawers, while Vinny maintained crowd control. The entire operation was improvised now, nothing like the precise military exercise Mark had planned. As they moved toward the bank's rear exit, Mark kept his weapon trained on the space between Burke and the guards. "Detective, I want you to know something. Every time you've threatened me, every time you've made assumptions about what a German immigrant could accomplish in your American system, you've been making a mistake." "What mistake is that?" "You've been teaching me how your system really works, and now I'm going to use that education." They reached the rear exit where Eddie had positioned their escape vehicle. The whole robbery had taken less than 8 minutes, but it felt like hours. "This is Detective Raymond Burke," Burke was shouting into the bank's telephone as they departed. "I need all units converging on First National Brooklyn. The German and his crew are heading west in a dark Packard." But Eddie was already threading the vehicle through back alleys Mark had mapped weeks earlier, following routes designed to avoid main streets and police stations. Within 15 minutes, they had switched to a second vehicle in a predetermined location, then to a third car that would take them out of the city entirely. As Brooklyn disappeared behind them, Mark counted their take. Nearly $8,000. More money than any of them had ever seen at one time. "Jesus, Mark," Tommy breathed, his hands shaking from adrenaline. "I thought we were dead when Burke showed up." "Burke made the same mistake everyone else makes," Mark replied, "checking their rear for pursuit. He assumed we'd panic under pressure instead of adapting to changing circumstances." Vinny was studying Mark with new respect. "The way you handled that standoff, that wasn't luck. That was skill." "That was training," Mark corrected. "Military? Training applied to civilian problems." They drove in silence for several miles before Eddie spoke up from behind the wheel. "So what now? Burke knows who we are. He'll have every cop in the state looking for us." Mark stared out at the American countryside rolling past their windows. The successful robbery had proven his theories about applying military tactics to criminal enterprises, but it had also marked him as a priority target for law enforcement. "Now we disappear for a while," he said finally. "Let Burke waste resources looking for small-time bank robbers while we plan something bigger." "Bigger how?" Mark smiled grimly. "Burke thinks he's dealing with desperate immigrants who got lucky once. He has no idea what's coming next." As they drove toward their safe house in Pennsylvania, Mark began formulating plans that would revolutionize American bank robbery. Burke's interference had forced him to abandon his careful, methodical approach in favor of improvised tactics, and the improvisation had worked perfectly. The lesson was clear. If you were smart enough, disciplined enough, and ruthless enough, you could outmaneuver any authority figure, no matter how much power they thought they wielded. Detective Burke had intended to capture a criminal. Instead, he had created a legend. 6 months after the Brooklyn job, Mark Hansen had become a ghost. The Pennsylvania safe house had served its purpose for a few weeks before the crew moved to Ohio, then Indiana, then Missouri. They left no traces, no patterns that law enforcement could follow, but they also left no banks untouched. Using the refined tactics Mark had developed from their Brooklyn experience, the crew had successfully robbed 11 banks across 4 states. Each heist was more sophisticated than the last, incorporating lessons learned from previous operations. The total take approached $50,000, enough money to disappear forever if they chose. Mark chose differently. He'd established a base of operations in Chicago where the crew could blend into the city's diverse population and extensive criminal underworld. More importantly, Chicago offered opportunities for recruitment and expansion that smaller cities couldn't match. The crew had grown from 4 men to nearly a dozen, all selected using Mark's military criteria: discipline, reliability, specialized skills, and the ability to follow orders under pressure. They operated like a small army, with Mark as the commanding officer, and each man assigned specific roles based on his strengths. Detective Burke had been pursuing them relentlessly, but his investigation was hampered by jurisdictional limitations and the crew's careful operational security. Local police forces were unprepared for criminals who planned like generals and executed like elite soldiers. The newspapers had begun calling Mark the Professor because of his methodical approach to bank robbery. Editorial writers debated. whether he represented a new evolution in criminal behavior or simply a well-educated thug who'd gotten lucky. Mark read every article, studying how the press portrayed his operations and what details law enforcement was releasing to the public. The coverage revealed more about police investigative methods than the authorities probably intended. On a cold December morning, Mark sat in a Chicago diner reading the latest headlines when a familiar voice interrupted his breakfast. "Mind if I join you, Professor?" Detective Burke slid into the opposite booth without waiting for permission. He looked older than Mark remembered, thinner, with deeper lines around his eyes, and a weariness that suggested long nights and frustrating. "Leeds." "Detective Burke," Mark said calmly, setting down his newspaper. "I wondered when you'd catch up with me." "Took longer than I expected," Burke admitted. "You've gotten good at this disappearing act." Mark studied the detective's posture and expression. Burke was alone, which meant either he was conducting unofficial surveillance or he had backup positioned outside. Either way, this wasn't an arrest attempt. "What do you want, Detective?" Burke signaled the waitress for coffee before answering. "I want to understand you, Hansen. Or whatever your real name is. Most criminals, they're driven by desperation or greed or just plain stupidity. But you're different." "How so?" "You plan? Like a chess master, but you execute like a soldier. You've turned bank robbery into a science. That takes intelligence, education, training. So what I want to know is, what turned a smart man like you into a criminal?" Mark sipped his coffee, considering how much truth to reveal. "The same thing that turns smart men into detectives, I suppose. Circumstances and choices. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get." Burke leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Here's what I know about you, Hansen. You're not American-born. That accent gives you away. You've had military training, probably European. You came to this country with skills and intelligence, but something went wrong, something that made you choose this path instead of an honest life." Mark felt a familiar flash of anger at Burke's assumptions. "You think this is about choice? You think I woke up one morning and decided to become a criminal for fun? Then tell me what it was about." Mark looked out the diner window at the busy Chicago street, filled with people going about their legitimate business. It was about learning that honest work and good character mean nothing if you have the wrong accent, the wrong background, the wrong friends in power. "So this is revenge against America?" "This is survival," Mark corrected, "against men who use their authority to destroy people they don't like, then act surprised when those people fight back." Burke was quiet for a long moment, studying Mark's face. "You're talking about someone specific, someone who hurt you before you ever came to America." Mark said nothing, but his silence confirmed Burke's suspicion. "And then you got here and found more of the same," Burke continued. "Men in uniform who treated you like the enemy because of where you came from." "Men like you, Detective." Burke had the grace to look uncomfortable. Maybe I did let my war experiences color my judgment about Germans. But that doesn't justify what you've become." "What I've become is successful," Mark replied. "Successful enough to sit here having coffee with the detective who's been chasing me for months, knowing there's nothing you can do about it." "I could arrest you right now." "On what charges? Being German in a public place? Having coffee while suspicious?" Burke smiled grimly. "You're right. I don't have enough evidence yet. But I will, Hansen. Because men like you always make mistakes eventually. They get overconfident, careless, start believing their own legends." Mark stood up, leaving money on the table for his breakfast. "Detective, the only mistake I've made is spending too much time trying to succeed in a system designed to exclude men like me. I won't make that mistake again. This isn't over between us." "No," Mark agreed. "It isn't. But next time we meet, the circumstances will be very different." As Mark walked out of the diner, he felt Burke's eyes following him. The detective represented everything he'd come to despise about American authority: the casual prejudice, the assumption of moral superiority, the belief that badges and uniforms justified any behavior. But Burke had also revealed something important. Law enforcement was starting to understand the threat that Mark represented. They were adapting. Their methods, sharing information across jurisdictions, treating his crew as a serious criminal organization rather than ordinary bank robbers. The game was escalating, and Mark welcomed the challenge. That evening, he called a meeting of his entire crew in the back room of a Chicago speakeasy. 12 men gathered around a table covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and detailed intelligence. Reports on potential targets. "Gentlemen," Mark began, "we've proven that military tactics can revolutionize criminal enterprises. We've made more money in 6 months than most crews make in years. But success brings attention, and attention brings pressure." Tommy raised his hand. "You thinking we should lay low for a while?" "I'm thinking we should go bigger," Mark replied. "Big enough that law enforcement can't ignore us, but too big for them to stop us." Eddie looked concerned. "What did you have in mind?" Mark smiled, pointing to a location on the map of Illinois. "The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, the biggest score in the history of American crime." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Robbing a Federal Reserve Bank wasn't just criminal, it was an act of war against the American financial system. "That's impossible," Vinny said finally. "The security, the federal response, we'd never get away with it." "Men said the same thing about our first bank job," Mark reminded him. "They said a German immigrant could never outthink American law enforcement. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now." As Mark began outlining his preliminary plans for the Federal Reserve job, he thought about his conversation with Burke. The detective had asked what turned a smart man into a criminal. The answer was simple. Smart men became criminals when the system left them no other choice for success. And once they made that choice, the only remaining question was, how far? They were willing to go. Mark Hansen was about to show America exactly how far that could be. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago stood like a fortress in the heart of the financial district, its limestone walls and bulletproof windows, designed to withstand everything short of artillery bombardment. For 3 months, Mark Hansen had studied every aspect of the building, from its architectural blueprints to the personal schedules of its security staff. The plan he'd developed was his masterpiece, a complex operation involving multiple diversions, precisely timed coordination, and escape routes that would take them across state lines before federal agents could respond. It would require every man in his crew and several new recruits, all working with the precision of a military unit. But as Mark sat in his Chicago apartment on the morning of December 15, 1925, reviewing the final details, he received news that changed everything. Tommy burst through the door without knocking, his face pale with panic. "Mark, we got problems. Big problems." "What kind of problems?" "Burke got to Eddie. They picked him up last night on some trumped-up charge, and he's talking, singing like a canary about everything. The crew, our operations, even this Federal Reserve job." Mark felt the familiar cold fury settling over him. Once again, law enforcement was using underhanded tactics to destroy what he'd built through skill and planning. Once again, men with badges thought they could manipulate the system to guarantee their victory. "How much does Eddie know?" "Enough to get us all the electric chair," Tommy replied grimly. "Burke's probably mobilizing every federal agent between here and Washington. They'll be waiting for us at the Federal Reserve." Mark walked to his window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. In the distance, he could see the Federal Reserve Building, the target that would have established him as the greatest criminal in American history. "Sir?" Tommy asked. "What are we going to do?" Mark smiled at the unconscious military formality. Even in crisis, his men still looked to him for leadership and direction. The respect he'd never received from Colonel Weber or Detective Burke, he'd earned from criminals and outcasts. "We're going to finish this properly," Mark said finally. "You mean abort the Federal Reserve job?" "I mean we're going to teach Detective Burke and his federal friends what happens when they underestimate German military planning." Over the next 6 hours, Mark transformed the Federal Reserve operation into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. Instead of simply robbing the bank, they would stage the robbery as planned, while simultaneously hitting 3 other Chicago banks, creating chaos that would scatter police resources across the entire city. But the real objective wasn't money. It was sending a message. At 2 p.m., Mark's crew struck all 4 targets simultaneously. The Federal Reserve job was a feint, designed to draw maximum law enforcement response, while the other 3 operations collected the actual prize money. Within 30 minutes, they had stolen over $100,000 and created the largest manhunt in Chicago history. Detective Burke arrived at the Federal Reserve Building to find it untouched, except for a single envelope addressed to him personally. Inside was a typewritten note. Detective Burke, you wanted to know what kind of man I really am. Now you know. A smart man becomes a criminal when honest men with badges make it impossible for him to succeed any other way. You created me. Detective, remember that. M.H. The coordinated robberies made national headlines. Editorial writers called it the most sophisticated criminal operation in American history. Federal authorities admitted privately that they were dealing with an entirely new type of criminal organization, but Mark Hansen never saw the newspaper coverage. 3 days after the Chicago jobs, police surrounded a small farmhouse outside Indianapolis, where Mark and his remaining crew had taken refuge. The tip came from Eddie, who'd provided details about all their safe houses in exchange for a reduced sentence. The siege lasted 18 hours. Federal agents, state police, and local sheriff's deputies surrounded the property with overwhelming firepower. Negotiators tried to convince Mark to surrender, promising fair treatment and a chance to tell his side of the story. Mark's response was a single rifle shot that shattered the spotlight they'd aimed at the farmhouse. As dawn broke on December 19, 1925, Mark sat in the farmhouse kitchen with Tommy and 2 other crew members who'd refused to abandon him. Their ammunition was running low, and the authorities showed no signs of backing down. "You know how this ends, don't you?" Tommy asked quietly. Mark nodded, cleaning his Luger with the same methodical care he'd once used to maintain his Prussian military equipment. "The same way it always ends for men like us, on our own terms." "Any regrets?" Mark thought about the question seriously. He remembered the idealistic young soldier who'd believed in honor and duty, the desperate immigrant who'd tried to build an honest life in America, the criminal mastermind who'd revolutionized bank robbery through military precision. "I regret that men like Weber and Burke made this necessary," he said finally, "but I don't regret fighting back." Outside, a federal agent was shouting through a megaphone, "Hansen, this is your final chance to surrender. Come out with your—" "Hands up!" Mark stood up, checking his weapon one last time. Through the kitchen window, he could see dozens of law enforcement officers positioned behind cars and trees, all of them waiting for his next move. "Tommy," he said, "when this is over, I want you to remember something. We weren't just criminals. We were soldiers in a war most people don't even know is being fought." "What war is that?" "The war between men who accept the world as it is, and men who refuse to be crushed by systems designed to destroy them." Mark walked to the front door, knowing that opening it would trigger the final firefight, but he also knew that his legend was already secure. Across America, other immigrants and outcasts would hear the story of the German soldier who'd turned military tactics into criminal science, who'd outfoxed federal agents and local police alike, who'd refused to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. The techniques he'd developed would inspire a generation of bank robbers. The precedent he'd set would force law enforcement to evolve their methods. The message he'd sent would echo through American criminal history. Mark Hansen opened the door and stepped into the morning sunlight, his Luger raised defiantly against the assembled forces of American law and order. The shooting began immediately, but he'd already achieved something more valuable than survival. He'd proven that even the most powerful systems could be beaten by men smart enough, determined enough, and ruthless enough to refuse acceptance of defeat. As the gunfire erupted around the Indiana farmhouse, Detective Burke stood among the federal agents, watching the final chapter of a chase that had consumed 2 years of his life. The German immigrant had been everything Burke had predicted: intelligent, dangerous, and ultimately self-destructive. But as Burke watched Mark Hansen make his last stand, He couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something larger than the death of a criminal. He was watching the end of a man who'd been created by the very system that was now destroying him. In the aftermath, when the shooting stopped and the silence settled over the farmhouse, Burke found himself wondering what might have happened if America had found a place for Marcus Hoffman's talents instead of forcing him to become Mark. Hanson's crimes. It was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The newspapers called it the end of the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history. But for the men who'd served under Mark Hanson's leadership, it was something else entirely. It was proof that even in defeat, a man could choose to go down fighting rather than accept the judgment of those who'd never understood him in the first place. And sometimes that choice was victory enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.